Welcome back to another segment of Poets in Montana. I'm Mark Gibbons, and today's guest is a poet from Helena, Montana. Sean Hill is with us today, and welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Mark.
I didn't do a lot of research on your biography, but having read your poetry, I know that you are a Georgia native.
Yes.
And how did you arrive in Montana? I guess there's a good question.
That is a good question. My wife got a job here, and so we moved here for her job. But also we moved here because we liked Montana.
Yeah. So, had you been here before you moved here?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Years ago, I guess it's about 2005. I took a road trip. I used to live in northern Minnesota.
Okay.
Bemidji, Minnesota.
Yeah.
And my then partner and I, we decided to head out to Vancouver from Bemidji on a road trip, and we came through, and ended up spending the night in Jordan, Montana. Which was a very fascinating place to sort of find yourself at on a road trip. And then we went to Glacier and tromped around and just kind of kept going west.
Right.
And then came back through. And then in 2005, my wife, we at that point, I was living in Alaska. We were living in Alaska. And we'd taken a road trip down to California, and on the way back to California, we stopped in Helena.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I did. I did note that in your biographical details or whatever, there was reference to the fact that you have set foot in every single state of the Union.
Yes.
So you have toured around.
I have. Yeah.
You got to look at things.
And I think about half the Canadian provinces. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it's been a privilege. Yeah.
And this year, since this fall, you've been the Hugo visiting poet. Is that right?
Yeah. I'm one of the visiting poets there now. Yeah. I think I was a Hugo, but now it's like after
Hugo.
After Hugo time. Yeah. And this is actually my second year. I'm like halfway through my second year there as a visitor. Yeah.
Wow, so almost semi-permanent visitor.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah.
Well, cool. And that's going well?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Cool.
The students are fantastic, and the colleagues are just great people to work with. Yeah.
Right. Well, I've certainly enjoyed reading your work. I think you're, Kevin Young. I first discovered the poem from Blood Ties in that anthology that Kevin Young just did, that big African American anthology. That's a monster.
Yeah.
It took a long time to get through that.
Yeah.
It was a great book.
It is.
Really a great book. What a historical document. And that's an interesting aspect, I guess, about your poetry that is that there's a lot of history. I mean,
yeah. No, I do a bit of research to find things that are going to spark the poems. I have these obsessions, and I chase them down in archives, and and the poems come out.
Poets tend to be a little obsessive sometimes.
Right. Yeah, I feel like. There's this thing like find your voice. I feel like just like refine your voice, but recognize your obsessions is kind of the way I think about it.
There you go.
Yeah. So I'm always trying to refine my voice and just keep my obsessions close.
Yeah. Well, why don't you read us a poem or two and give us a taste of what you're up to?
Yeah. I think. Yeah, I had an idea, but I think I'm gonna shift gears because of what you just said. So my first collection, Blood Ties and Brown Liquor, I did a bit of research, looking at old newspapers and reading history books and talking to old folks and trying to get a sense of what my hometown, Milledgeville, Georgia, was like before I was born, long before I was born. Because I felt like growing up there and sort of being educated in the public school system in the South, there were certain things that weren't talked about. I mean, it wasn't until I was a senior in high school that sort of segregation and desegregation was brought up. I was a senior in 1991, and I was on the school newspaper staff, and I was assigned to write about the 20th anniversary of desegregation, which meant in 1970-71, that's when they desegregated schools. And I like, that wasn't a part of how we were taught.
Right.
You know, we were taught the dates, like, you know, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, 55, yada, yada. And like, no one said, but it took till 1970 till this actually happened here. And across much of the South, like, that's what all deliberate speed meant.
Right.
And so, like, that kind of kicked me off into thinking about history and trying to, like, sort of figure out what happened?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why is it taking this long?
Right. And so, in researching Blood Ties and Brown Liquor, one of the sort of fascinating things I came across, fascinating to me and kept my attention, was a mention of people, African Americans, leaving Milledgeville and the surrounding area sort of during Reconstruction, like in the 1870s, early 1870s, and going to Liberia. And that didn't fit in Blood Ties and Brown Liquor, but it ended up finding its way into Dangerous Goods. And so, and there were a couple of stories that were in the newspaper that I was just kind of fascinated by, because there was one guy who went over, turns out he was a young man, like their ages weren't really disclosed in the newspaper articles. I had to do a little research to figure out, you know, what was going on there. But this one guy went over, Alan Yancey, and, you know, there wasn't modern medicine at the time anywhere. And so, you know, he lost some family members, I think a wife and maybe a child or two to, like, some fever. But he was like, I'm staying in Liberia. It's actually a lot better than being in Georgia. And, you know, I have more liberties here to realize my potential. And there was another man, older man, turns out, Sandy Ganaway, who came back, or was trying to get back to Georgia. Actually, the article was written from New York, and he was trying to, like, you know, I'm coming back if someone can help me get back. I've made it to New York.
Yeah.
Trying to get back to Milledgeville. And I wanted to write poems about these men. And so I did eventually. And, you know, with a name like Sandy Ganaway, you kind of have to write a poem about that guy.
That's a great poem.
Yeah. So Sandy Ganaway got a poem. Ganaway returns, 1874. Broke in New York and trying to get home. Old Sandy Ganaway, older than Milledgeville by a couple of years, wants to get back to where he'd been freed after being owned, before being born. Home, Georgia. He's seen Africa, and Liberia in nearly every way did not agree with the old man. Recognized faces, but didn't know the natives like folks back home, and never took a liking to the food or the way the light shone. Liberia, created for those folks freed after being owned, before being born, and old Sandy Ganaway never embraced as mother and long-lost son returned home. It couldn't hold him the way the land of his fathers, owners and owned, held on. Where old Sandy Ganaway can conceive of dying, as each and every man must, is the land he knows like his wife's arms. Where does home come from? The same place as race? Man is always inventing things, such as nations like Liberia and America, where Sandy was freed after being owned, before being born.
That's a great poem. I love that poem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And you learn a lot, you know. I mean, for those of us that are, you know, somewhat uneducated, Liberia, that story, you
Right,
know, I mean,
right.
the fact that that was a land created for people to return to or to.
Well, no, it wasn't returned. That's
Yeah.
the thing. These were African Americans. I mean, the same as the colonists were like, actually, we're no longer colonists. We are generations born here. We are Americans.
Right.
We're making a claim for this place.
Right.
Yeah, those people were African Americans. They had, for generations, been born there. And a lot of the people who went there, there were protests by African Americans, free blacks, in the North against Liberia as a solution, because that's what it was proposed as. It's like, oh, well, we don't know what to do with black people. There are all these schemes to use the sort of 18th and 19th century idea of like, it's with the plans, basically plans for what to do with black people. There were some that were like, well, we'll just put them on the frontier, like on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, where it, you know, hasn't been settled. Maybe we'll give them some part of some southern state, and then sort of modeling on Britain's. The British had Sierra Leone, and they sort of carved out Sierra Leone as a space to put recaptured enslaved people or slaves, recaptured Africans, because at that point they had abolished slavery and the slave trade in 1808. And so if a British ship came across a slaver ship, they were supposed to like take those people and put them back on the continent, but they were like, we can't just release these people because they might just get captured again, recaptured. So they created Sierra Leone, and so this group of folk got together and proposed and got government funding to create a space called Liberia, where they would send African Americans, because we have to do something. We have to do something with them, and a lot of people who ended up there were people who were freed after the people who owned them died, and felt, because this was sort of the generation of folk coming out of the revolution, they were like, well, maybe we shouldn't be enslaving people, but we don't want them here. And so instead of, in my will, instead of, you know, having them being inherited by my next of kin, which actually those black people could have also been their next of kin, if you want to be honest about that. Instead of them being inherited by my next of kin, I will free them. So they would be, but they had to make a choice. Like, and a lot of African Americans had connections and ties to family here, and so it was like either, you know, stay enslaved in America, where I might still maybe be able to see family if they don't get sold by their master, who someone else owns them, or go to Liberia and be free, where I won't see them ever again.
Right. So it basically was choice. They were given a choice for Liberia, right? I mean,
right. It was like, it's a hard choice. You
Yeah.
had like, you can leave your family or you know, go and go, or stay here, be enslaved, and maybe you can still see your kids occasionally if the people who control you so very much, who own you, deem that possible.
Right.
And yeah.
And that poem captures that pull at whatever home is.
Right. Well, that's the thing. Like, after the Civil War and emancipation, like, people went by choice, but then you're trying to figure out what is home at that point. And for Sandy, which I think I'm kind of interested in, right? That this 70-year-old man was like, I'm 70 something. I've been around since like, before Milledgeville, basically. And everything I know is there, and I tried to make it go and change my life, but I can't at this point. And we are, we've been emancipated. It's going to be hard, but I'd rather be back in Georgia than be in Liberia. And other people sort of came back for different reasons. But yeah, it was like, how do you find home? Where do you find your liberties? Where do you find your identity?
Right.
What is a home?
Right.
Which is a big part of this book. I mean,
and I noticed that it was in this book, there was, at one point you gave like the Wright family tree a couple of pages to look at, and that went back to 1800 in this country.
Right, yeah.
That's a lot of generations of people. I mean, even though they had, strange lives because they were slaves and traded as property, but
right.
Yeah, no, I mean that's my own history in this country is 1917. So.
Right. No. Yeah. So, as far back as I could trace on record, in terms of a number, it was 1812 for me. The Wright family is not my family; it's a fictional family. But the story that their story is sort of a lot of people's story. It's in part my story too. And my great-grandfather was a long-lived man who had 3 families, and my grandmother's family was his 3rd family. He was born in 1856 and was someone's property. His father was born in 1812 and was someone's property. And in the record that I could find, it identified his mother, I think, as being born in Virginia and his father being born in Georgia. So he was not someone who came over here on a boat. My great-great-grandfather. My great-great-great-grandfather was born in Georgia. My great-great-grandmother was born in Virginia before 1812. So, yes, the 18th century, the 1700s, is as far back as I can have some paper record of.
Yeah, that's a while.
Yeah, African American.
Right.
American. Right.
You're here.
Yeah. Right.
What else would you be?
Been here. Yeah. As we say.
Well, share another poem, if you would. I mean, and your voice is, you have a great reading voice too.
Thank you. So yeah, the Wright family, I invented this character. He kind of came to me. I don't know, like the name just kind of came to me, and then the character coalesced around this name. Silas Wright was his name. And I then had to figure out, like, well, how do you create a character? Like, what actually is coalescing around this name? And then, like, how do you sort of invent a life? And for me, it was like, well, I have to think about events. Like, what does this character do? I think fiction writers work differently. Or like there have to be choices made and conflicts and blah, blah, blah. And as a poet, I'm like, I just want to describe things. And so I was like, well, he's got to write his name. Let me describe him writing his name. So I write about Silas learning to write his name. Silas Wright at age 7, 1914. Silas Wright follows a fish's wriggle in the shallows between reeds. He scribes the line in his tablet, as much pride in that line as a man in his son. He almost giggles. Still he goes on. The next letters come easy. With this he'll have more than a mark to bind. Rambling across the page, again and again, in messy rows, on it flows until he goes a little off the page's edge. he smiles. He's surprised to hear when his mouth opens. That's mine.
Cool. What do you have any idea? I mean, historically, because you have done a lot of research in terms of schools and duration of time spent there. You know, for like males, females, and
it varied.
It is in Georgia, right?
Yeah, it was in Georgia. It varied. There were freedmen schools following emancipation, free blacks, and some white folks from the North came and opened up these schools. And there were schools that sort of carried on after Reconstruction too. I believe, actually talking to my grandma, if I believe correctly, I think my grandmother maybe went to the 6th grade. Like the schools didn't go, like you didn't have the same amount of schooling as you do now.
Right.
But that was kind of historically, like Lincoln, I think, went to maybe a year and a half, 2 years of school. Like our President Lincoln.
Right.
Like, so people, there were schools, people went to school, people also educated themselves outside of school. But yeah, so there was a school that was in Milledgeville for the black school, was the Eddy School.
Right.
And there were segregated schools, again, up until the 1970, 71 school year.
It's just amazing.
Yeah, so.
I didn't realize that. I mean, I should have, I guess. I mean, obviously we're sitting up here in total white protection,
Right.
and watching it all on television. Basically, the extent of the civil rights movement,
Right.
and reading it in the newspaper, and
Right.
but that.
Well, there were African Americans here too. But
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
There certainly were.
And indigenous people here, they're Butte, America is
Right.
a hugely diverse place at one point.
Right.
I was talking to my son, it's a line in a poem I'm working on now, but trying to explain to him all kinds of things. We have these interesting conversations sometimes, and especially if I have the radio on and the news is on, he asks questions like, what's this border thing? What are they talking about? So exponentially, like we have our house, we have our neighborhood, we have a block, our neighborhood, and sort of like this is, how things are thought of, conceived. And at some point I was like, a town or a city is really nothing more than ambition and opportunity come together. And I mean, that's what Butte was. It's
Right.
like there's just people with ambition and some opportunity, and like we're gonna make something happen here.
It was a city of
Yeah.
everything,
Right.
and everyone.
Right. Yeah. So.
I remember when you said that, because I mean it really, and there was a drainage just west of Alberton that had an infamous name, Gulch.
Right. Yeah.
And that was named because there was a black man and his wife, and I think a couple of kids. I saw one photograph that lived at the mouth of that drainage, and that was what it was named, and it remained that, of course, all the way until the early 1970s, when finally, the government decided that, well, we should rename this on the maps, at least, because that's what it was. And I remember my mother telling me the stories. They grew up in Dillon, which is down south of Butte, and there was an old gentleman there that used to. He was a janitor for a couple of different places, the local theater for one, and she had taken me there. I was just a little 2-year-old or whatever, and in this one soda fountain, and there he was, and we walked in, and I'm like, and I doing this kind of a pointing thing, right? And she's like, no, that's and this old gentleman says, oh, now let that boy off. He's never seen a black man, or he's never seen black skin before. It's okay. Let him get over here real close and take a good look, you know, and that whole sort of a thing. And because I'd never, and I don't even remember that, of course, but she told me that story. You know? But they were few and far between, black people, in my world growing up in this state.
Yeah.
You know? As opposed to Native Americans. We did see a lot more Native Americans,
Right.
obviously,
Right.
for obvious reasons, but yeah.
Yeah, I think African Americans are 13%. We've been sort of holding steady at 13% of the population for a while. And, you know, so there is a way in which we can be few and far between. And in Montana, I think it's 0.6%.
But it's growing.
Yeah, but it's growing.
It is growing.
Yeah. But it's been here. Actually, you reminded me of a poem. This is a new poem. A very new poem. A very, very new poem. I was going to say that. But, you know, there was this woman, Clarissa, I believe she was Clarissa Powell. She was owned by some people who came up the Missouri right at the end of the Civil War, and by the time everything wrapped up, they were getting off the boat at Fort Benton, and she was then free because emancipation.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was an African American woman who stepped off the boat into freedom, and she met an African American gentleman. She was, I think, 11 at the time, and he was maybe 16, but had fought served in the Union Army, and was out here working. And at some point, a few years later, I think they finally got married. Anyway, there's this poem, Clarissa Lands. Long ago, way before the story involving you, water found the easy way through this landscape, the only way it knew, collected where gravity guided, winded ever down, gathered trickles to an eventual river, what's called the Missouri, and in the then wars waning, you traveled up that water by measures to the territory of Montana, a land of fresh starts. You disembarked the Lily Martin to freedom. This marked the end of a peculiar misery for millions of your fellows. This, the other end of a long journey begun with an embarkment, the Middle Passage. In the new light of freedom, no longer property of those who brought you this far to this sublime land, you, not even a teen, had to lean on the promise of Reconstruction as the shadows of black codes and Jim Crow grew with notions of our people, the casus belli, as they find new uses and abuses for us. Any viewed as you or our kind were to be confined, bound to help define whiteness. And in this heart-stretching land, you met a young man, James, and y'all laid claim to a new life, a legacy.
Nice.
And James Crump was his name, and the Crump family was a prominent family, African-American family in Helena, and they built the house kind of around the corner, down the street and around the corner from where I live now. And they lived in that house. Family members lived in that house for 150 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
That's a great story.
I think something along those lines.
Did Clarissa arrive by herself at 11?
Again, the people who owned her, yeah. So I mean,
So I mean, as soon as they got here, then she was on her own.
I don't know the exact details of that.
Yeah.
They may have employed her for a while.
Right, right.
Because they couldn't own her anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I think, because I know just in, earlier in this last century, then the 20th century, like my parents' age, who were born in the, 17, in the first part of the century, a lot of those people, when they were young, through the Depression and just after, and the war and all that, a lot of them were on their own. I mean, 8, 9 years old, they were, for various reasons, usually money and those kinds of issues. One parent dies and another one comes in and hell breaks loose. And, that kind of stuff. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Did I say 150 years? I think 100 years, over 100 years, but yeah.
Right.
A long time.
Yeah.
in Helena. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So are you working on sort of stuff in Montana at this point?
Working on some stuff in Montana, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I look forward to that.
Yeah. This new collection is, it's trotting old ground too. So I'm going back to Milledgeville and looking at some African American lives around the Civil War there, and then tracking people who moved after the Civil War west, sort of that migration. People who came to Montana, people in Alaska, Washington State, various places. And then it also, this new book will track my migrations from, Georgia to northern Minnesota to Alaska, mostly to Alaska, and then, Montana.
Right.
And
Right.
and I have some sci-fi stuff I'm trying to work on with this, that where we're out in space in a few hundred years.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
Well, yes. Something else you want to share with us, or you spent time in Houston too? I see.
I did. That's where I got my MFA in Houston. Really liked Houston. I think it is my only big city. I've never really lived in a large city. I grew up in a small town of about 40,000 or so people. And then I went to the University of Georgia, which is like 100,000 or so at the time when I was there. And then Houston. And then from Houston, I went to northern Minnesota, Bemidji, Minnesota, which is, I think when I got there, it was like 12,000 people. And then from Houston, or from Bemidji, I ended up in Alaska, in Fairbanks, which is about 35,000. And since then, I've kind of lived in places of about 35,000 people, which is interesting when you change the context. Like in Alaska, 35,000 makes Fairbanks the second largest city.
Yeah, right.
And I did have a brief stay in Statesboro, Georgia, before coming here. So between Fairbanks and here, I was briefly in Statesboro, which is 35,000 people, and in Georgia, that is a small town.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. And then you spent the night in Jordan, Montana.
Right.
Which is a very small town by Montana standards.
Yeah. I had dinner at the Hell Creek Bar.
There you go.
Yeah, which was a lovely place. Yeah.
Well, why don't you share another one?
Okay. I think, can I share two more?
Sure. Oh, please. Yeah, we got time. So
Okay. All right.
until Ron gives me the hand signal, we're going to read and.
Okay.
And
So I feel like there's a progression here. I need to I'm up to 3 more.
All right.
I have a little.
Let's go for it.
Little run here. Yeah, moved to Fairbanks, and I'd seen Northern Lights in northern Minnesota, and they were spectacular. There's a poem in Dangerous Goods about seeing the Northern Lights, but they were just like almost every night in Fairbanks. It felt like, or not every night, but it just like they were just there.
Right.
And I had a friend, a colleague there, who would sometimes call me and be like, "Oh, the lights are out. go get outside." And I ended up writing a poem sort of about the Northern Lights in Alaska and just kind of being far away from family in Georgia and elsewhere. One of those early days poems where you're like, what is this place and where am I and how far away am I from everything I know? Musica Universalis in Fairbanks. Each night, this 21st century frontier town settles enough for me to hear the thrum and hiss in my ears, my tinnitus, which I choose to think of as the harmony of my firmament, all so far away. Like the whoosh and hiss from Nana's gas heater that warmed the winter-chilled bedroom in Georgia while she got the skillet sizzling with country-cured ham in the kitchen. My refrigerator occasionally wakes this hour to clear its throat and rumble on over the sounds in my ears. And some nights I get out of bed to go stand under the generosity of stars here. I've decided that must be the collective noun for all the stars in one's gaze, as it must also be for any number of scars. The way we refer to a flock of starlings as a murmuration. I stand there and use my hand to shade my eyes from the street lights to better see the stars. Our new light competes with the old, the way the clamor of our fleets in this age after sails is said to interfere with the songs of whales. Here, I sometimes see the aurora borealis, silent, which seems impossible, like the end of the world for what we know of light in the sky, lightning, and its often not far off companion, thunder, seems to say something will always follow. Some say the northern lights sizzle, an impossibility, a synesthetic weaving of the senses exalting this light, or a lark, like the bird, which we call an exaltation when in numbers great or small, more than a handful, the way a friend used to count lovers when he was younger, told me he was on to the second hand. Love, while a lark, still handled carefully in those days. I should drive out of town to view these lights against the sky, black as a raven. They often fly in pairs or groups, a conspiracy, a storytelling, an unkindness of ravens.
Nice.
Thank you. Thank you. So, well, in Alaska, I met the woman who became my wife. I wrote No Bod. The poem about lovers parting at the dawn. So I wrote this Obod. And Alaska's kind of an interesting place to write No Bod. So yeah, especially in the winter or in the summer. November, Fairbanks, Alaska, and Obad. We're heading toward the end, and here now there is something missing. Morning. The dawn's not rousing till most folks in Fairbanks are at their day jobs. Morning sleeps in here this time of year, and who could blame it, as cold as it is? Is it dreaming of the warm dark of the South? In this long night that came with what should have been early evening or even late afternoon most other places, gauged by the clock's dance with the sun, 9-to-5ers driving in the night both ways on weekdays, you and I have held hands, had words and dinner, danced, tumbled, and tussled before wrestling. My snoring, your nudging, the dogs budging only to snuggle closer. And now I need to get up and write this poem before I return to bed, the only warm dark to be known here, just before the sky lightens to that blue that precedes the peachy dawn, so the street lights can sleep. This new day's sky affords enough light to see your face and sate my need to see you again before you wake to see me, before we rise to get about our days, or hopefully stay in bed a little longer.
Nice. I read something earlier today when I was reading this, and I don't remember the poem, but it was another poem that you spent gazing upon the visage of
Yes.
a companion,
Yes.
her mouth.
Yeah.
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 And I was reminded of experiences like that.
Right.
Which is what a good poem does.
Yes. Oh, us poets. Yeah. And then I read those two poems to get to this poem.
All right.
Which is a poem about seeing my son for the first time, the ultrasound of what would become my son, of who would become my son. Yeah. Hello. She, being the midwife and your mother's longtime friend, said, "I see a heart. Can you see it?" And on the gray display of the ultrasound, there you were as you were, our nugget, in that moment becoming a shrimp or a comma, punctuating the whole of of my life, separating its parts before and after, a shrimp in the sea of your mother, and I couldn't help but see the fast beating of your heart translated on that screen, and think and say to her, to the room, to your mother, to myself, "It looks like a twinkling star." I imagine I'm not the first to say that either. Unlike the first moments of my everyday, the new of seeing you was the first, deserving of the definite article, moment I saw a star at once so small and so big, so close and getting closer every day, I pray.
How old's your son?
He is now 6. Yeah.
Did you have just the one child?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Actually, there's. I feel like I wanted to go back and touch on like the Alaska experience. Like one of the things, like you sort of going different places, it gives you perspective on all kinds of things, like sociological things and geological things and astronomical things. And one of the things was up there. At some point, I realized that there was no warm and dark that I grew up with in the South. Like at some point, in the summer it gets dark and lightning bugs and fireflies come out.
right.
You know, like even in Minnesota, there's like a dark and warm time, but like there is no dark, warm time in Alaska, at least not right when I lived there. There may be now with all the
Yeah,
global climate change, but yeah, global warming. But yeah, there was no cold, dark, and that I didn't think about that before I went there, or no warm, dark. You know, it was only after coming back in the summertime down to the lower 48. It was like, wait a minute, it's gotten dark, and I can wear a T-shirt and be comfortable.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah, I've never been to Alaska, but I know other people have told me the same kind of stuff. You know, it's
Yeah.
just that you hear about it, of course, and it's never quite the same until you experience it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh. Is there something you wanted me to read?
Well, you could read, the last place where I kind of left off was, as I was telling you earlier, was etymology in a subway in Houston, and then a couple that followed after that. Well, Ganaway, you read Ganaway,
yeah.
but and then the postcard, the photograph postcard, the postcards and the photograph. But well, one of those two, or both of them, whatever you want to read.
I'll read that one.
Yeah.
I'll read the postcard. It was. There's kind of two versions of that poem in this book, but I mean they're really different. So I don't think of them as the same version, but or the same poem, but they treat the same material. And the first version, I was still sort of coming off the project of having written Blood Ties and Brown Liquor, and the way in which I'd given myself constraints in terms of language, lexicon, form, and how to treat the subjects in the poems. How to figure out how to go about writing a poem for that book, and I wanted to like loosen up and sort of get back to some of the things I'd been doing before taking on that project. And so I wrote this poem about the lynching that happened in Duluth in 1920. That was a little abstracted as part of the project. I wanted to be a little abstracted and see like what that would look like. And then I took it into a workshop, and people were like, "Huh, this is a little abstracted. It's a really interesting poem. Nothing really wrong with the poem per se. It's just that they wanted more emotion. It was too maybe abstracted and cerebral. They wanted more emotion." And it took me some time to think about what that meant, because they were like, "This is a poem about a lynching. Where's the anger? Where's the rage?" Because that was where they went. You know, suggestion. It seems an obvious thing to do, but for me, like, I sat on it for a while and realized that what I really needed was to find the emotion that I could explore with the subject, and for me, that emotion was sorrow. And so I wrote a poem, the poem you're talking about, the photograph taken in Duluth. Sorrow. And when I wrote this poem, my grandmother was alive, and there was a period in my life when she died, like a couple of years after I wrote this poem, and I went to go give a reading in my hometown, and it was the first time I read this poem after she died, and I cried my whole way through this poem, and it took me a couple of years of reading this poem to audiences before I didn't cry at all. I still get choked up sometimes.
Did she hear it?
I don't know. No, she did.
Did she read it?
No, I don't think she did. Yeah.
Curious.
Yeah. There are some poems in the first collection that sort of are fictionalized poems that are drawn from some of her life experiences. Like she's kind of the subject of those poems, but it's not her.
Right.
And she read those poems, and she's like, "Well, that's nice." And that was kind of that was it. She's like, "I don't really need to read anything else." Yeah, yeah. And I don't really need you to write anything else about me. It's like, okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though it's not about her. So. Yeah. But we had a lot of conversations when I was writing that book. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then this is kind of me imagining it. Like I was imagining having conversations with her about this thing, but we never had these conversations. Her voice is in my head. A photograph taken in Duluth. My grandmother says, "Beg pardon," when she hasn't heard what you've said, or is certain you can't have meant what she heard, like, "I think the moon must have squinted at the dim light of that gas lamp post and the 3 men that hung from it." What I mean is 3 men, black, in town with the circus, accused of the usual lynch law crime, were chosen from 6 and dragged from jail one by men who formed a mob, propped up by thousands of bystanders who didn't join in with the hoisting of these black men up the lamppost for allegedly violating a white woman, of course, but registered approval with fists and feet while they made way for the black men, or didn't stop the hand or foot of the woman or man next to them. So 3 beaten bodies violently shook, shuddered, sputtered blood on those close by, and came to rest. My grandmother says, "Hush," when she's heard what you've said and doesn't want to believe it. But I have a photograph, proof of what happened in Duluth. For that, I must say, thank you kindly. That's how my grandmother always says it. To a photographer from across the bay in Superior, Wisconsin, on hand with the thousands of other souls crowding downtown Duluth that June evening. I know he didn't take it from me. My grandmother says, "Have mercy," when she's heard a burdensome truth, such as the photograph was soon made into a postcard that sold quite well in local retail outlets as a memento. My grandmother didn't need to know these men. She wasn't born yet, but doesn't need to be shown this photograph to know the crowd of faces staring into the searchlight. Some lean forward and stretch their necks to make certain they're in the picture. One smiles while Elias Clayton's body lies face down at his feet, hung so high they had to cut him down to be in the shot. And Isaac McGee and Elmer Jackson hang with their necks stretched, heads lolled to the side, faces turned as if they should be the ones bearing the shame or regret. This photograph isn't necessary for my grandmother to know that this happened and can still happen. And that's why my grandmother sighs and says, "Hush."
God damn it. That's a hell of a poem, man.
Thank
and I
you.
think that you owe a lot to your grandmother for it. You know, I mean that her in there.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
And the restrained. It strengthens it to a great extent. It seems like to me the power of it is. I'm glad you read that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I miss her. Yeah.
It's I mean it's just it's so hard to believe all of that, really, the details of it, and then of course the situation that we've seen recently, the developments that we've seen around the country in the last few years. I think it's even more important that poem be heard,
Yeah.
and thought about.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of the same thing. We're in a similar space. Yeah. But
You have one to kind of close on here? We're getting probably pretty close.
Yep. Things,
And,
things do change. Things do change.
Well, yeah, let's hope. I mean, that we keep hoping, we keep moving. Things have changed.
We have to work at that, but yeah. It's like the struggle continues. The struggle is the thing. We can't just like, oh, it's done. It's never done. It's like we have to keep doing this thing. So this is another ultrasound poem. It's a new poem. I'll end with this one. Sounding a silhouette. From the living room, I see my son, 5 years on in the world, in the walk-through pantry, looking for a snack, and his profile, backlit by the kitchen lights, takes me back to that second ultrasound, the first view of him from the blind of this side of my wife's womb. The tech, she and I spied on him, and I was surprised to see clearly his mouth and nose, his chin, his forehead, the shadow he casts now in profile, save for his hair, again straight and spiky like when he was born. In the capsule of her body, his lips moved, as if he were talking to someone, or like when I'm mulling over something to myself, my mouth a part of that. His silhouette, a word I struggle to spell every time, like endeavor, at once stops me and starts me to thinking about the old way of capturing a likeness popular in 19th century parlors and 20th century kindergarten classrooms, like the one in which I sat in 1979 in the recently desegregated South, and we, lit by the repurposed projector, white and black, all cast shadows that our teacher cut out. His profile, as he forges for fruit leather, bears a new bit of self-determination, takes me to the written by himself of slave narratives, attempts to convey the state of chattel slavery, to capture the captivity of a people, our ancestors and their descendants. And I wonder what his ancestor would think of him, this little brown boy with a white mother. I wonder what he will author. I wonder what future dreams he may have for who may descend from him, and what they'll endeavor to do. I think about that final shuttle, the Endeavor, one of its first missions, its repair of the Hubble telescope, our best for sounding the depths of the black of space, and all the rockets and capsules tethered to mission control by only the chord of language that got us there.
All right. Nice one to end on.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I feel like much of this is language. Much of this is language.
Yeah.
How we talk about each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wish we had another hour to do this and explore more of what you've got to share. There's a whole lot of people for me to interview, but I may get back to that.
Sure.
You may get the call again.
Yeah,
I've done this
yeah.
with 2 or 3 other people. It's like, damn, time is up.
Yeah.
We don't want to do this.
Yeah,
Let's
yeah.
stop. So, yeah, thank you
Yeah.
very much, man.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Sean Hill, thanks for joining us again for another episode of Poets in Montana. We'll do one more next week. Join us. So long.
A lifetime filled